Well, welcome everyone to this week's masterclass on diversity and inclusion. I'm Bill Gerard. Carrie Brox is not going to be able to be with us today, so it's up to me to welcome you all in, one and all, guests as well as our presenters and panelists, etc. So welcome to this session. I'm really looking forward to this. This is one of the ones that I think is going to be suitably important for people in this industry going forward. So just before I begin much further, what I'd like to do is very quickly just acknowledge the original custodians of this land that I'm on and that you're on, and pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So welcome everyone. And what we're going to do now is really get to understand this whole issue of diversity and inclusion. And as you would have seen, we're doing it over two master classes. This first masterclass is going to be about what I would call understanding diversity and inclusion. And you're going to hear from a round table of people who have got different experiences in this area. And we're going to try to understand just exactly what we're talking about when we mean it, because it's a big subject. In our next masterclass, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can embrace diversity and inclusion. And for me, I thought it was a very important topic for us to be looking at. Not only us as learning and development professionals that are working with all sorts of constituents, therefore we need to be thinking in a very diverse and inclusive way. But I also think that we have a role in influencing the broader community. And I think that as we work with people, whether they're in the classroom, online, or with corporate organizations, I think we have a duty in some ways to actually press and promote the idea of diversity and inclusions. And so that's why I thought this was so important that we have a panel to work with us on that. So that's what we're going to be exploring. And just before we do that, just a couple of little housekeeping things. First of all, we have the live transcriptions going on. If you click on closed captions on the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see that. There's also the running script if you want to look at that. The other thing is, I guess, if you wouldn't mind muting, except when you're speaking, that would be a helpful thing to do. And we do want, well, we have a panel of a number of informed professionals. We do want to hear from participants as well. So what we'll do is ask you to put any questions or comments, or if you'd like to add something in for us and join the conversation, put a note in chat and I'll be monitoring that so that we can actually get you involved as much as possible. So that's basically what we're looking at. So what are we doing? What we're going to be trying to do over the course of the two days is to, first of all, as I said, understand diversity. What does it mean? What's happening in the world right now? What's working? What's not working? That sort of thing. And then I guess the second part is really about what can we do as L&D professionals? What can the community do? How do we actually embrace this whole side of things? So those are the big questions we're going to ask. And we're going to try to keep these sessions fairly straightforward and simple. We've got a number of broad questions, because this is a far-reaching subject that I'm going to put to the panel, and they're going to basically just talk us through it, build off of each other, and again, we want your contributions in the chat room. So let's get started. And first of all, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Amy Tilden with us, Gail Miller, Ainslee Hooper, Lyndal Box, Sonali D'silva, Adam LeGood, and we also have Andrew Mountford. So we have a good group of people that have been involved with these two sessions, and we have a number of participants as well on the thing. So welcome everybody to the session. What I'd like to do is basically get each of the panelists to introduce themselves and basically just tell us a little bit about who you are and what is your experience in 2 minutes with diversity and inclusion, just so we can get started. And just looking at my screen, I might start with Gail. She's on my right, so I'll start with Gail.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Gail Miller from Adelaide. My experience with disability and inclusion is mum lost a leg in a car accident when I was 17. So for over 40 years, I've actually been looking out for things that are difficult for mum and ways that we can include her. It was really interesting. She walked with an artificial leg, but when we had to take her out in a wheelchair, she was treated very, very differently. And that rang alarm bells in my mind. Eventually, I went on to write a children's book to educate children from a young age about the fact that everyone needs to be included.
Thanks, Gail. Why don't we go to Adam? Adam, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, I'm Adam Lagood. I got involved in what was then called Equal Employment Opportunities back in, I'd rather not say, but 1989, when I was working for the Victorian Public Service and was the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer there, and have been working in that field and so for many, many years. When I stepped into my training role, I continued that work in terms of training and recruitment, and of course the equity and merit issues of the recruitment process. So I've come at it from that perspective, yeah, looking at diversity and inclusion more recently, working with a specialist in the area and just looking at the programs that Michelle runs in various different organisations. So just, you know, re-exploring it a little bit at the moment. So that's me. And I'm here in Melbourne too. So
Good stuff. Thanks, Adam. I didn't realize you could get a job with the public service when you're only 10.
Oh, you're so kind.
Lyndal, tell us about yourself and your involvement with diversity and inclusion.
Okay, well, my world started with the opposite of diversity, because I grew up in Bendigo, which at the time had the dubious title of being the most Anglo-Saxon city in all of Australia. So when I went to university, my world opened up and I realised, my goodness, what have I been missing? There's so much more out here. And I went to university and studied teaching and became a teacher, and realised that as a teacher, we're not catering to people very well. And in my immediate family, I had 2 immediate family members with learning disabilities that had profoundly affected the way they felt about themselves and their level of inclusion in society, because they couldn't read. So I guess it sort of became a passion for me to make sure that everybody felt included, and that if someone was turning up and they weren't behaving really well, that it might not be just because they're badly behaved. There could be something else going on, and usually there is. So in my working career, I've sort of geared myself to work more in environments that have diverse means of operating. And I've worked for the NDIA for a while and worked with people with disability, and worked for GenU, who were looking at bringing people for long-term unemployment back to the workforce, people who don't have a lot of digital skills. And in particular, my most recent work is with a screen reader user, making sure that people with assistive technology are able to access the world of learning just like the rest of us, and we're not blocking them out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lyndal. And welcome. Sonali, why don't we switch over to you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Sonali, thanks, Bill. And lovely to be here, to be part of this, and welcome to all our participants today. Thanks for your time. As you can tell from my Australian accent, I'm from India, and did grow up there for most of my life, worked there and built my career around learning and development, went into leadership development at some point in my career, did a lot of cultural competence related work, traveled to many countries, and didn't realize that a lot of what I was doing was inclusive, leadership kind of work, or it was diversity awareness sort of work. We didn't have labels back then. So after a long career with corporates, now in Australia, in Adelaide, I run my own business called Equality Consulting, and I focus on inclusive leadership, diversity awareness, helping women shape their voice and shape their careers as leaders in organizations. So that's another bit of passionate work that I love to do. And I talk about inclusion as something everyone can work on. Me being a brown person in a predominantly white country does not make me an equitable person by default. And that's a kind of a hard truth to face up to, because people think I must have a really good handle on race relations and racial equity conversations. But I have caught myself uncomfortably often being myself a racist, being a sexist, a homophobe, a bigot. And it's been enlightening to look within myself, even if it's been quite uncomfortable. But that's where I learn a lot of my lessons, and gives me heart that if we can look at ourselves with some level of empathy, inclusion is not that difficult. Good to be here.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Sonali, and thank you for sharing with us. Ainslee.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Ainslee Hooper, Ainslee Hooper Consulting. So I'm a anthropologist and a disability inclusion consultant. So I come to diversity and inclusion from a different angle. So I've got a lived experience of disability, being in a wheelchair all my life, or being a wheelchair user all my life. I catch myself saying that in a wheelchair, which I don't like, but anyway. So for me, it's been an interesting journey, because along the way, there's been things that, I guess the way I look at it is like, I talk about ableism, and so ableism is like sexism and racism for people with disabilities, and ableism leads to inaccessibility, and inaccessibility leads to exclusion. So I look at inclusion and diversity from the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm more about looking at it from the grassroots level and seeing how we can address barriers in society to then promote inclusion all the way up to the top.
Okay, nice, thank you, and welcome as well. Let's go to Andrew. Andrew, come on in.
Yeah, folks, I've got 3 points, and Adam reminded me about EEO. I had the job in the public sector too. You put me into a mild trauma, Adam, raising that, because it was very hard being in a room with a whole group of lots of men who didn't really think there was an issue. The 3 dot points I had was, I'm based here in Melbourne. I've been in the learning and development, organisational development, change field for about 40 years. I think I was once, in my later work career, the co-designer and facilitator of some residential leadership programs for one of the biggest retailers in Australia. And diversity sessions were a big part of it, because they had the most diverse workplace. And it was a real challenge for me as a trainer to suddenly be confronted by this diverse group in a room together. Had a few wines one night, and the highlight was being taught Bollywood dancing. I'm currently working as a director now of a small non-profit called African Family Services, which is really meaningful for me. And it's a rich diversity of people in their thinking, their feeling, their strengths and their values, age, cultural, gender diversity. It's an ongoing place for reflection and challenge. And finally, I'm an active member and a recent office holder of the Australian Association for Psychological Type. So think of the diversity of personality and temperaments across any population.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome. Amy, I think that leaves you.
Lucky last. Love it. Thank you.
Beautiful day there, by the way. Beautiful blue sky.
I know, it's stunning, isn't it? It's stunning. Yeah. I am in Brisbane, so it's okay. So I'm the L&OD business partner for Cromwell Property Group here in Brisbane. Previous to this, I've worked so I come from the professional perspective and the corporate perspective, a number of large multinational corporations. I kind of fell into learning and development through from my high school job, which turned into a 15-year job, which I left a number of years ago now. Just from that education perspective and ongoing lifelong learning, and from a corporate perspective, you tend to have such a large amount of people that don't really know what they're doing. So that's where I kind of come into things and making sure that people are educated and kind of have that diversity of thought and conversations about this, and opening the perspectives of boards and the executive team to see where we can make changes for the better as well. So, and then obviously from a personal perspective, diversity and inclusion, I'm a mother of 4. So I've got 2 little, not 2, 4, 4 humans to mold into better adults. down the track as well to see whether they can make their difference down in their lives as well. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amy, and welcome. And welcome, everyone. So that's our call them a panel at this stage. Those are the people that have been working with me to formulate this masterclass. And so again, thank you for that. One of the things that I want to start with is trying to get a grasp upon what we mean by diversity and then inclusion. Because when I think of diversity, I think that, there's almost 7 billion people on the world, and they're all different in some way, shape, or form. So what's going to happen, I think, is that the diversity is everywhere. And we're seeing it in gender terms, in political terms, in a whole raft of different ways. And to me, it strikes as being very difficult to actually understand just the breadth of diversity. Andrew mentioned the psychological type. You've got 16 different types in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and there's all these different aspects and ways of looking at things. So I'm really interested in finding out how we approach the topic and how we might define diversity, and from each of you from different perspectives about how you might look at it. And Amy, I might actually start with you because you're in the corporate area and you're on you're head of a committee looking at that. So at diversity inclusion, are they seen as similar things that you're working on, or how do you approach it there? And then everybody else, please do kick in and add to that as we move along as well. But I'll call on different people as we move forward. But Amy, can I get your perspective and maybe bring in the perspective as well of your organization, Cromwell?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. So I chair the Australian Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee for Cromwell. We have 3. There's another one that sits within Singapore and another across Europe as well. So we're across 15 different countries. So lots of different people in lots of different locations experiencing lots of different things as well. So our purpose with the subcommittees is to make sure that we do have that diversity of thought and opinion as well when it comes to making decisions within the business. We think that is absolutely key to making the right decisions. From a business that's in financial services, we do have that typical executive team that is heavily, if I could, if my hands aren't going to go, it's very heavily middle-aged male focused executive team making decisions. So we're very, very purposeful in our actions and making sure that we have the voice of everybody in the business to make sure that we are making the right decisions. And that could be from anything, whether to, at the moment, we're having significant discussions around what flexibility looks like in 2021. We have all different types of discussions about what everything looks like, and making sure that what is happening is right for everybody and everybody's voice is heard. From myself in my learning space that I work in, we focus on that education and from all different levels of the business. So educating people about the difference between diversity and inclusion. So definitely looking at how they work together, but how they are very, very different aspects of the topic, which through doing some executive sessions last year with our people leaders, that was actually a brand new concept to a lot of people, actually, to look at those as 2 different particular things, which was really enlightening, and the discussions that we had from that were absolutely fantastic as well. So it's just that continued conversation and making sure that it is being raised in every discussion and meeting and decision making within the business is key.
Good, thank you. Yeah, and I want to come back to you a little bit later when we start talking about barriers and what things might get in the way of us embracing this. But for now, I'd like to continue to explore what do we mean by diversity and inclusion from different perspectives. Lyndal, can I ask you, because you're working with Gen U on the things, plus you've got your own passions. How are you looking at the idea of diversity and inclusion, and are they the flip side of the same thing, or what?
I love definitions. To me, diversity is all of us, because not one of us is the same. And even though we like to pigeonhole and stereotype people, and our brains tend to work that way as well, but I think diversity is just, it's all of us. And the difference between that and inclusion is inclusion's when we all work and get along and get it going really well. And so I always say I'm working towards inclusion, because inclusion to me is like the perfection state. It's, you know, this is when it's all going right. And when we say things, we don't offend people. And when we do things, we don't shut them out. And when we say what we're doing, you know, it all makes sense to everyone. That's my goal when I'm doing learning. So when it comes to Gen U and working with a really diverse background of people, I'm looking at the learning from an inclusion lens, saying, if I put this word in here, is this going to offend someone? Or if I create this document, are people with assistive technology going to be able to use it? Or are people who don't have enough money for data, for the internet, are they going to be able to download it? And if I keep thinking like that and I keep asking myself those questions, I think I'm on the path to making sure that I'm including as many people as possible. And I don't ever always get it right. And I think being open to getting feedback about how we could be doing things better is the way to go, and continue on that path towards perfection, which I think is inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess inclusion means that everybody that's in part of the process wants to be included, and wants others to be included with them. And that isn't always the case, I would suggest. Does anyone want to comment on that idea of inclusion and maybe their experience with diversity and inclusion from a personal point of view, maybe, or what they've noticed? Gail, would you like to say something? Yeah, please.
Yeah, when Lyndal was talking, it just reminded me of a list that I have in a workshop that I run. And I asked the participants to, let's whiteboard all the different types of diversity. So we had appearance, size, like underweight, overweight. You know, I discovered when working with a very, very thin dental nurse that she gets very offended by people saying, oh, you're so thin. That really upsets her. She actually ate more than any other adult I've ever seen, but she had a very high speed metabolism. So that was offensive to her, but people assume that you're only going to be offended if you're overweight and someone comments. So that was an eye-opener. Then religion, culture, sexual preference, age. Age can be a bit of a barrier. You know, I'm too old for this, or I'm too young for this, or people saying, oh no, you'll never get that because you're this, that, or something else. Even dress code or auditory processing. Sometimes we assume someone may be being rude. Perhaps they have an auditory processing disorder, which means they actually need a little bit more time to think about something. These are all diversities: skin colour, speech impediments, race, even dietary differences. You know, if somebody sits down in the lunchroom and they've got something vastly different, or something that smells strange to us, you know, we need to be tolerant. Disability, hobbies and interests, or, you know, tastes in movies and music. All of these are different diversities and part of our everyday life. So I think the thing that I'm really learning is that we need to raise our awareness of what's going on and lower our judgments of what's going on.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's also then, I guess, how we react to it. I was fascinated by something I just saw on the underline of the news today about in New Zealand, a Maori MP was ejected from the House because he wasn't wearing a necktie. And I thought, really? You would not have expected that in a place like New Zealand with the focus that they have. Ainslee, do you have anything you could share with us about how, you know, from a personal perspective, but also a professional perspective, what you see as diversity and the whole aspect of how we think about inclusion, and because I think it's about it's to me, it's got to be a bit of a mindset to say I want to include and I want to be included, and because there's two sides of a coin, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, so for me, like I was just when we were talking, Gail and Linda were talking, it reminded me, I was on a Geelong business breakfast once, and I was on a table, and this was just prior to the NDIA rolling out. So I was on a panel called Lead Bowen, which was about helping people understand disability and understand how the NDIS was going to help us. And when I was on this table, obviously this particular person hadn't seen that I was in a wheelchair, because and that's happened before, they can't see the wheelchair when I'm sitting down at the table. But yeah, so this particular, there was a question raised in this meeting, and it was about how can we, it was something about getting people with disabilities in Geelong more, getting them more into the central district. And yeah, someone commented that they don't see people with disabilities in Geelong. And then it's like, well, yeah, so that person clearly, and yes, it was at the time, I just thought that was odd, but then it was such an eye-opener, because people still assume that people with disabilities, it's going to be visible when it's not. I mean, yes, there's 20% of us in Australia, but that includes physical, so yeah, like visible and invisible disabilities as well. So it's about understanding that disabilities is a spectrum, and therefore that needs to be included in diversity. And that's a thing that I've found in the D&I space. It's very interesting that when we talk about D&I, it's usually gender and race, and disability is not included very much. And I asked the reason why that is, and the response was that people are too scared to touch disability. And that really was such an eye-opener to me as to why that is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I just find the whole challenge of it enormous. It's just even getting my head around it in some cases. Sonali, I wanted to pick up on what you were saying before, because I think you said as someone with brown skin, you obviously seem different in this country in other ways, but you also mentioned a range of other things. How are you looking at the idea of diversity and the focus on inclusion and being included?
Bill, I think what everybody else has said puts me in a good position to kind of summarize a bit as well. And I think all the important things have been spoken. And if we were to look at it in a bit of a nutshell, we'd say diversity is both invisible and visible differences. And it's everything that shapes our identities and helps us experience the world in specific ways. So things that shape our identity and help us experience the world in specific ways. So then there are, as Gail was saying, and there was such a lovely example, when you open your lunchbox and you're eating something that other people don't recognize as usual or normal or expected, that becomes our sense of diversity, because it's shaping our identity and how we are experiencing that lunch table in some ways. So that's a good way to process it, so that we can include as much as possible and not overwhelm ourselves, but at least entertain the possibility that it is way beyond gender, disability, and race, which is what takes all of our attention. As Ainslee said, actually gender and race keep trumping disability as well. And inclusion then is the act of acknowledging that these differences are valuable to the workplace. So inclusion is an act. It's not just a belief. It is an intention, but it's an act. So you do a set of things to let people know that their differences are valuable to the workplace, not in terms of, oh, it's really nice to have you, and plus it makes us look good. But these are the business reasons why it's really important to have your thought process. So let's create a safe workplace where your identities can then help us get to shared goals. And so that's something that we can think of and ask ourselves, how are we valuing people's contributions, even if we don't fully understand their sense of diversity. And I think I'll let you move on from there, that we don't always have to understand someone's identity fully before we are inclusive of them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I like that whole theme of well, it's visible and not visible, because I think that stands out, and I sense that potentially it's the stuff that's more visible that we tend to be able to take effect of. But Andrew, I might just switch to you, because you're worked on both sides of these things. But when you think about psychological type and all of the other typing processes that are out there, that's another level of diversity. And I know back, 30 years ago when I worked for a living, I had a team of a dozen consultants, and on one of the team profiling processes that I had one of my psychologists work with, I had somebody from every component, which I'd done not with any design in mind, but because I wanted that mix of people. And it made it very challenging to work with them because they were all so different. But at the same time, it gave me a really powerful team of people that I could create change with. What's your gist on that side of things, and where that fits in? And do you see any aspect from an inclusion point of view?
Yeah. When I think of psychological type and Myers-Briggs, there's always a group of people who say, I don't like that stuff, I don't want to be stereotyped. And I very much agree with them. And coming to work with that in a professional way and a deeper way is to say, I saw John Williamson being sketched by Ando, if you see Ando on the TV. And Ando said to him, what would be your message for the next generation? And John Williamson stuck up his thumb and said, get your fingerprint. You've mentioned the 7 billion people on the planet, Bill. You're the only one like that. Mm. So for me, things like psychological type and difference, they're a starting point. You're on a chessboard and you've got a place where you start, but you can go anywhere. But the best important thing to do with all those frameworks, whatever they are, and I've used plenty of psychometrics and theories of people. I love theories and models, but if they're used to box people, then I think they're misused. If they're used to listen to other people, it's like somebody said to me, we get these books on psychological type. There are 16 types. What we do, go straight to the pages that talk about our type. Whereas really that should be the last chapter or the last page we ever look at. We should be exploring what makes the other people different? What can I learn from them? And yeah, so I find it valuable model. I love being part of the association, but it's a theory of preference, not a theory of behavior.
Exactly. I think that's a beautiful way of saying it.
Yeah.
And I think as well, I mentioned at the beginning of this masterclass that I feel that there's something that L&D professionals can understand and promote the whole idea of diversity. I know when I first went out on my own, one of the things I did is I went down and while I'd done a number of other profiling processes, I actually went down and became an MBTI facilitator, not because I wanted to actually facilitate in that, but because I wanted to understand that process so that when I was working with people, I could facilitate better. I could actually adapt better to the different ways that different people learn. And of course, that wasn't the only one. There's a dozen other different types that you can use. And I think it's that understanding of, whether you're a problem solver or an ideator or an implementer, those kind of things are all part of that diversity things that when you understand some of those things, you can then make an influence and issue on a difference in that area. Adam, we've talked to everybody at this stage. Do you want to add anything in at this stage on where you see diversity and inclusion?
It's interesting, and this is just sort of culminating from everything that everybody else has said, but the catchphrase, for want of a better term, that's in my brain at the moment is that diversity is a fact. I mean, you turn on your Zoom, have a look at and we're just talking about faces here, but we could talk about introversion, extroversion, we could talk about left-handedness, right-handedness. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion, however, is a choice. And I can't know the needs of all my team. If I've got a team of 10 people, I can't know all their diverse needs. But I think it was Sonali who said, it might have been Lyndal, but we need to include them before we know everything about them. But I also need to be fascinated by them. I grew up. My mum taught English to migrants when they arrived in Australia. So I grew up in this very multicultural environment at home, although I'm Anglo-Saxon and, from Manchester originally and all that sort of stuff. But I have smelt all those foods, Sonali. And my reaction is, can I have a bit? Usually it kills me, but that's all right. I'll still try. But I grew up in that very multicultural environment. And what I learned from that is to be fascinated by the difference of others. And going then to what Andrew said, I became a Myers-Briggs facilitator longer ago than I'd like to admit to. But again, the psychological differences fascinated me as well. And I don't know, Ainslie, what it's like to be in a wheelchair. So I'd love to, to be a person who uses a wheelchair. So I've learned something new today. But I'd be fascinated to find out what that experience is. And I think if we have that fascination and curiosity for other carbon-based life forms, I think that's a wonderful thing. So yeah, look, so my summary of all that is diversity is a fact, inclusion's a choice, and we've got to make that choice.
Yeah, and I think it's also what Lyndal had talked about with it. It's a journey,
Yeah.
a destination that'll never actually be reached, or if it is, it's well ahead into the future, and probably in pockets.
Just on that, sorry, Gail, I saw you raise your hand there. Just on that, when I was training in New Zealand a few years ago, I was just doing what I normally did, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "You've offended all the Maori in the room." And I said, "How?" And they said, "You sat on the table." And I said, "Yeah, I'm an old man, I'm tired." And they said, No. In Maori culture, it's very offensive to put your bottom where food will go. And I said, "Oh, we do that all the time in Australia." But I had no idea that was offensive in their culture.
Yeah.
So I learned. And so from then on, when I trained in New Zealand, I moved the table away so that I couldn't sit on it because it was my habit.
Yes. Yeah. Nice idea. Gail, did you want to say something?
I was just thinking, diversity too is something that never even occurred to me. Like Mum and Dad befriended one of the very first Vietnamese boat refugee families back in the 70s. And I just thought that sort of thing was normal. Dad was a builder and he had Italian and Yugoslavian subcontractors who worked for him. And Dad always would greet them, and we learnt to do the same. Hello, goodbye, please, thank you, and how are you? I just assumed that if you met someone from another culture, you needed to know those things. So years later, when I was in my late teens, I met a lady who wouldn't eat rice because of the Japanese in the war. And I was absolutely gobsmacked because I'd never experienced anything like that when I was growing up. All I knew was that regardless of what colour skin you were, what religion, what anything, you included people. So I'm really grateful for my upbringing and that I didn't know any difference as a child.
I think that's probably fair to say for almost everyone. You only know what you know. Growing up in Winnipeg, where the community that I was with in the north end of Winnipeg, we had the Jewish community, the Ukrainian community, the Greek Orthodox community. We had the gangs, the things like that. So everybody was quite different. It's really quite amazing. We've got a relatively small group here. So what I thought I'd do is break from our plan and just throw it open. Neil, Julie, Fran, and Kim and Ann, if you want to join in just and say anything, please just put up your hand or let me know, and you're very welcome to join this conversation. This is something that's right there, and Pamela, of course, as well. I missed you there because you're slightly offbeat. So just feel that you're included in this process as well. That's it. Okay, what I want to do now, I think, is just change the tactic a little bit and see if we can understand a little bit more about, I guess, the challenges that we're faced with. And I guess I would really value an understanding of the challenges that some of you have experienced or know people that have experienced them, and the challenges of lack of understanding of diversity, lack of inclusion. But also I'm really interested in finding out what are the barriers to some of the stuff that's going on. How do we actually make some changes? And so what's standing in our way? What are some of the challenges and hurdles we need to look at in order for us to start to embrace diversity and move along that journey towards inclusion? And I'm happy to let someone pop up there. Go ahead, Gail.
Ainslie, a minute ago, corrected herself when she said she was in a wheelchair, and she said she was a wheelchair user. When I interviewed people for my What We're Really Like book, they all said that terminology is huge and it can make or break a situation. They said we are not wheelchair bound. It's not a disabled toilet. It's an accessible toilet. It's not a disabled car park. So they all conjure up notions of negativity. They want the terminology to be changed. And so if you have someone in a workplace and who uses a wheelchair and people say, oh, you know, Ainsley's wheelchair bound, that straight away is putting a label on her. Labels generally are attached with judgment. So these little things on an everyday basis are like pouring salt on an open wound. They're really great. Am I right in assuming this or saying this, Ainslee?
So for me, it's been a bit of a journey for me, like in the last few years, getting more and more. Okay, so I'll just do a very quick summary. So yes, I'm in my 40s and I've had disability all my life, but it wasn't until like in the last couple of decades where I had to start using disability services that I really got an insight into what it's like having a disability, because suddenly I've been treated as somebody who has a disability. But yeah, so the whole language thing has been I'm an anthropologist by training, so linguistics and all that kind of stuff is very fascinating to me. So, but I've learned along the way that it's not so much the words that are the problem, but the meaning behind the words. So, for example, I used to hate calling myself disabled. I'm happy with that now because I understand it's a political thing. So I think it's important that labels are addressed adequately, but we also need to look at what the meanings are behind those labels and get those kind of thought processes changed. So, but yeah, certainly like things like in a wheelchair bound. I used to say in a wheelchair, and then having this conversation, I was thinking, I remember children coming up to me and going, so do you sleep in your wheelchair? So, and that's because I used that term in a wheelchair and never sort of got to maybe any sense until now. So yeah, I think there's a mix of looking at the language you use, but also looking at what society's meanings are behind those and getting those thought processes changed.
Thanks, Ainsley.
Anyone else want to come in? Fran.
I think there's a piece to this puzzle, and forgive me, I wasn't here at the start. I kind of had a conflicting commitment, but I think there's a piece around equity, and maybe it was discussed earlier, but I think it's not just about diversity and inclusion. It's really about the accessibility to equal opportunity. And I think that's where the problem lies. And I'm not 100% sure about the choice in inclusion, because if you're the minority in a majority culture or, a minority group, then you don't have the choice to kind of be included. So it's up to us in the majority, and I'm kind of putting myself there. I'm in the majority in some ways. I'm a white English speaking person. I'm in and able-bodied. I'm in the minority because I'm getting to the higher end of the age bracket, or a woman. So all those elements that make up our identities, we're either in that privileged mob or we're not, and and that can vary depending on what elements of identity we're talking about. So I think that's a problem, and we don't all come with the same level of advantage. So if you're coming to a situation and you're a person of colour, or you come from a poor background, or you're not educated, or you're not able-bodied, there'll be some things where you're the minority or at disadvantage. And then I think it's for the rest of us to not only recognise the diversity, but really to try to level the playing fields, to become allies for the people that don't have that they're not starting from the same spot. You know, they don't have the same advantage. So I think that concept of equity, you know, I think that's something definitely worth thinking about. And it's going to vary, you know, like from circumstance to circumstance, you know, workplace to workplace, training room to training room, you know. But yeah, I'd like to see a little of that in the conversation. I'm not sure what others think.
I'd like to pipe in here and the difference between equality and equity. And I only just got my head around this, you know, a few years ago, but equality is treating everybody the same. And, you know, that's like saying we're all applying for a job, and one of the key selection criteria is we've all got to climb a tree. That's not equity. And when I did some work out at Monash University, they were addressing this issue because one of the paths to promotion were the number of I'm trying to just remember this in my head, the number of publications that you put out in a year or in a decade or whatever, and you had to have a certain number of publications in order to get the promotion to the next level of professor. And again, the details are a bit sketchy in here, but never mind. What they found, of course, was that their female academics were not progressing, and the female academics were not producing as many papers. And they realized that there was an equity issue because the female lecturers, the female academics were having time off for child rearing or childcare responsibilities and so on. And so they weren't as prolific in putting the stuff out, you know, in that traditional model. So they had to change their recruitment practices to be more equitable, so that the number of publications you put out was based on your circumstances and the different circumstances that you were in. And I think that's really important, that we can't treat everybody equally because we're not all equal. We're all different.
Yes, I think that's the key message, that we're all different.
Yeah, and we're not Cybermen. Yeah,
exactly right. And so what I'm hearing so far is there's a couple of barriers from what I'm hearing. One is language and the words we use and how we use them. And my suspicion is that there are people out there doing the best they can, but are uninformed about what they don't have a real understanding and connection to what Gail was talking about. And then I love that issue about equity and equality and things like that, because those are quite different things, is what I'm hearing. So that's good. Sonali, did you want to add in something on that?
Yeah, Bill, I think great point that Fran brought in, you know, of difference between equity and equality. And also one of the big challenges that sometimes we can't seem to offer people equity or inclusion is unconscious biases. And that's one of our big challenges. We know that there's lots of unconscious bias training out there, but we also know that it's not having the desired effect because we continue to not see the difference that would be proportionate to the investment in unconscious bias. So something is going wrong over there. I remember and let me take one of my own examples. And if, you know, it involves a transgender person. So if there's anybody in this group who identifies as a transgender person, hear me out till the end of my story. I grew up in India, in a fairly conservative, smallish town. And it was just my family who were, you know, a family of educators. So they had slightly different value systems than a trading town had at the time. And I remember nobody taught me as a child that transgender people are also people. And nobody also taught me that transgender people are, or it's okay to kind of look through them and not consider them people. So either ways, it's not like anyone was teaching me either equity or exclusion. But because, you know, conditioning is so forceful, I must have got some of that into me. And back in India, transgender people are marginalized in significant ways, and the country has done better over the decades since I was a teenager. And there's lots of good things happening through NGOs and the government as well. But back then, you know, their status was so deplorable. And I looked through that, even as a grown adult, it was okay to not see them as people, to consider that they weren't, they didn't exist for me. And there were two things that, I associated them with, which was one was prostitution, and the other was they would be begging on street intersections. And I grew up with that, normalizing that, not questioning what I thought about it, but why would I? I had no incentive. And fast forward to a few decades in Australia, a couple of years ago, someone said to me, oh, there's a person starting their own business, Sonali, why don't you talk to them? Because they are looking for some suggestions on starting out and they're struggling. So I was like, yeah, sure. And then the person says, oh, and by the way, they identify as a transgender person. She's a woman. So I was like, oh, all right. Now, I had had some brushes, so to speak, and willfully so with the LGBTQ plus community. So I had met other transgender people, but I had never quite sat across a table and had a one-on-one conversation and a coffee. And so all I was thinking was, Sonali, don't say anything dumb, please. And so when this person came across and sat next to me and we started talking, we had a wonderful conversation. And I can understand how this might come through for everybody. But I had, for want of a better word, a normal conversation. And I don't know what else I was expecting. One of us would grow horns at the end of it. I don't know. But, it was a wonderful conversation like two people would have about anything they shared. And at the end of it, as I was walking back home, the cafe was fairly close to my place here. As I was walking home, I was very thoughtful of my behavior. And I was filled with such shame and guilt and judgment, because one of the things that overpowered me, an emotion, was shame. And I thought, what if this woman ever found out what I really, really think about people like her, or deep down who I was? And what if I'm still that person? Or what I'm faking my way through inclusion, what a fraud, sitting there being nice and being compassionate and generous and normal, so to speak. But when I have harbored all those feelings and thoughts and biases, and it was very troublesome. And I had to spend some time in reflection. And I realized eventually that I had to forgive myself. I could not keep beating up on myself for what happened years ago, or was even there some years ago, as the person I was, and just be kind to myself, show some empathy and say, yes, that was me. And this is also me. This is the me who's trying to do better. And one of the big challenges is not just unconscious bias, because that's the popular statement out there. It is dealing with confronting unconscious bias, which is the real problem. Bias everybody has, we can't throw all of it out. It's not even good for us to get rid of all of our bias, but it's what it brings up is what's so troublesome, that shame, the guilt, that feeling that, am I a racist? Am I a bigot? Am I a sexist and everything else, an ableist? And am I that person because I'm a, God-fearing, religious or whatever, a kind, compassionate person? I can't be that also, but we are both, and many times. And so that's, for me, is a big challenge, not just the training of it, but the management of our emotions, and someone probably helping us through it if we don't know how to get through that.
So I guess what I'm hearing with that is one of the barriers that we have is within ourselves, and how we battle it out in many ways, and even getting that understanding of who we are. And I think, again, going back to the Lyndal's journey process, it's a case of we learn every day. I'm not the same person I was this morning. I'm a different person now, just as I'm sharing this with you all. I think it's a case of there's just so much going on there. And Lyndal, I know you want to add something to that.
Yeah, and piggybacking off that, I think we need to be kind to ourselves a little bit, don't we? Because in the space that I'm working in now, I know there's a lot of people who are unintentionally shutting some learners out of their learning. And it's not because it's something they want to do, it's something they just don't realise. And a great example of that is that my friend Di Ashworth, who also happens to be blind and she's a screen reader user, through this whole period of COVID containment has had to contend with that extra layer of being shut out because people aren't catering to people who use assistive technology online. And since we've all gone online, and since learning is all online, We need to make sure that what we're presenting out there actually does cater to everyone, but you don't know what you don't know. So I'm finding that a lot of people are not aware that, you know, somebody who's blind is going to not necessarily know how to navigate the online meeting platform that they're putting out there, or they might not be able to navigate their way through an online payment because it uses capture technology that recognises bots and considers the screen reader to be a bot and stops them from making the finalisation of their purchase. So there's so much for us to learn, and we do need to be kind and say, I can't always get it right, but I'm certainly open to feedback and what people can advise me, and I'll take it on board and I'll do my best.
Yeah, I think that learning process is so right. Somebody was talking a little bit earlier about we learn as we go. Might have been Adam, and I remember when MindWorks first started out and we were doing training all over the world. One of the things that you could buy was a thing called smart beans, and they were like little jelly beans, and they were labeled smart beans. And we thought, oh, those are kind of cool things to have given that we're teaching creative thinking and things like that. So we had these things coming out of our ears, and we give them out at workshops and all that kind of stuff, until we made the mistake of taking them up to Malaysia, because of course jelly beans are made of pork fat. And if you didn't know that, I just assumed it was sugar, right? But how many people knew it was pork fat? And so what ends up happening is we take it to a Muslim country and you go, really? Or you take it to Israel or whatever. But it's an honest mistake, but it's a mistake that you want to avoid. And as you say, you need to forgive yourself for that and learn and keep moving, and then ask yourself the thing. Ainslee says she's not going to be eating jelly beans again. Yeah, it's interesting. Amy, I'd love to bring you in on this, because again, I'm looking here at hurdles and barriers and things that get in our way from really understanding what diversity inclusion is, and from 15 countries, different committees, you know, you've got leadership groups, and there's the barriers of the one-on-one, but there's also the barriers of policies and things like that. And again, going back to what Fran had said, is that potentially it's the mob that has the majority. Or is it their responsibility to lead the way, and or how do we manage that in an environment like yours?
Yeah, it is difficult. And as everyone was speaking, I was busily writing down lots of notes and things to how I could reference it back, because we've got that challenge there where we're talking about the unconscious bias and how we as individuals, you know, interact with people. But I sit in a role where I need to influence the decision makers to put aside their own unconscious biases. So delicately have them recognized, but then obviously put that aside to make the better choice as to what's for the business, and then obviously for the broader employee group as well. So it's being able to have those really critical conversations with them, to be open to recognize where they might be putting those walls up to, and then actually being able to make better changes and better decisions with putting those to the side as well. So that's, I had put down a note here about talking about unconscious bias before you brought that up, Sonali, so thank you. The other challenge that we have is a lot of the business side of things is they want to make a decision based on data, and we have that challenge of being able to sensitively collect data in order to support being able to make those positive changes as well. So my side from the learning is again trying to educate and facilitate conversations and facilitate that broader thinking to encourage those changes when we don't necessarily have that data to support the decisions in the end as well. So it's that, and putting aside their fear too, because that's my biggest challenge, is that especially in the time coming out of COVID and, or well, not coming out of, but coming out of our Australian business, for instance, everyone's back in our offices, but we've still got the other half of our business over in Europe that are all still at home. So putting aside that fear as to what the business looks like and how we can be supporting our people and where all those people are and how diverse they are in geographical diversity and physical diversity and family diversity and absolutely everything to make everyone feel that inclusion and really encourage that inclusive behaviour and inclusive thinking in what they're doing as well. So it's significantly challenging because, you know, sitting there with an executive team and talking about unconscious bias, and they're having light bulb moments to themselves about how they might have been making decisions, and then having really critical conversations with them past that as well is really interesting, but also really challenging.
Yeah, because I guess what it starts with is, first of all, there's that got to have the desire to actually embrace it and learn, and
Correct.
acknowledge what you've got. And as we all have biases, we know that. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but you know, we have those there. But then I guess it's the actions that follow.
Correct.
It says, and we're going to talk more about that next time, about what actions can we take as individuals, as organizations, as learning and development. Right? But I'm also looking from a business set point of view. Of you talk about data, and the other one is return on investment and things like this. And I know, you know, in my business for the last 30 years, teaching people to think critically, think creatively, things like that, you would have said, gee, everybody needs to learn that stuff. But if you got to go to an organization, that the first thing they say was, well, what's the return on investment? And you say,
what's it going to cost for me to teach everybody that?
Yeah, you know, is it really a good idea for me to teach my people to think? You know, and you go, isn't this a no-brainer?
Yeah,
there is. It's not as simple as that. And so there's this aspect that says, yes, we want it, but we want to prove that it's going to be good, that it's going to be doable, that it's going to be, you know, an investment that's worthwhile. I think. Has anybody come up against anything like that in any work that they've done, where they've had the challenge of, you know, people want to do it, but they need to see the return? Has anybody? No? Okay.
I'll add more if you want to. I'm very lucky. I do work for a company who are very open to having these conversations. So that makes it easy. The money side of things always is the last end of the conversation, which is good. But the challenge will always be there. And I think everybody here would always have that as learning and development. It is something that you need to be able to see that exit part from a business perspective. But I am lucky that I work in a company that is open to it, which is fantastic. It is still it's a new concept still within the business though. We've only been working on this for the last couple of years proactively with a diversity leadership committee and you know, being really robust about it. But so far the strides that we've made has been fantastic, which I think it's just exciting, I guess, to be able to be involved in it and to be able to influence and use my own personal experiences and use my learning and my knowledge, you know, facilities to be able to encourage the adaptation of change and to encourage the diversity of thought and conversation as well.
Yeah, no, that's right. Adam, I wanted to come to you, and I saw you put up your hand as well, because you're the African group that you're working with and things
Andrew,
like that. Yeah. How do they feel, and what barriers might they see in terms of what it is you're doing, and what other comments do you have on what we've been discussing here?
Yeah, and my quick one on return on investment is in my whole training field, training career. I love pressing that question, but when you press the question of the people who are paying you, and you start asking them the hard question, so you want change. What sort of change do you want? You're going to model that from the top. Look, we're happy with the happy sheets.
Yeah.
When you press that question. A little story of reverse inclusion. So I come to African Family Services. I'm working with them as a volunteer. I'm talking about Africa, and one day one of them says, well, actually, Africa, there are 54 countries in Africa. So when you say Africa, who are you talking about? And I got educated. I find out that the Mauritian blokes I played soccer with in the 70s, they're Africans. I never thought Mauritius was a African country. I thought it was some exotic island in the middle of whatever ocean. So we got funding to run a program for 20 African Australian community leaders. And it was all about introducing them to the concept of family violence and prevention of family violence. We bring you on this program for 3 full days. You run a project, you go out to your community to talk about this. And the 2 women who are the co-founders were a bit reluctant to be up front. So we need a guy. We need a lot of them are coming in, they're males, and they'll respect a male. So we couldn't find a male, and they said, Andrew, you'll have to do it. And here I am going into it thinking, oh, the old white pale male, will I be accepted? So also, what gets in the way? Ourselves. So training design, you've got a full day, you've been paid a lot of money, so you're going to give them value for money. So they said to me, we'll go 9 till 4. And then somebody says, they won't come at 9. So I had a brilliant, okay, we'll advertise 8:30 start, and that way they can all have a coffee and tea when they get here. We start at 9. We started at 9:30, and I was calm at that point. And then we'd allowed 20 minutes for introductions, 20 people, minute each. They said, you go first. So I just told them a little bit about myself. Everybody in the room applauded. I thought, this is going to go well. 2 hours later, 2 hours later, everybody in that room, young women, older women, young guys, older guys, they all got to tell their story. They wanted to know that they did the questions. Where are you from? What are you doing now? How many languages do you speak? How did you come to Australia? And there was not one, the only person in the room that only spoke one language was me. Some of them had, the language of my village, which will die out when my parents' generation dies. I speak this language, that language, bit of French, bit of German, and I've learned English. So that whole thing for me about assumptions about what we bring, they're going to include me. So by the end of an hour and a half, I'm just sitting there laughing, thinking, okay, that's plan A out the window. Let's have plan B. It was a glorious program. I learned as much as anybody in that room. So what gets in the way? Ourselves.
Our feeling that we have to be the center and the focal point. No, I can imagine that, Andrew, because I know how you facilitate, and I love facilitation like that as well, where it's you got something you're trying to accomplish and you have a plan to do it, but you got to be prepared to throw the plan away in order to accomplish the things that you're trying to accomplish. I think that's great. So again, we've got a range of different blockages, beginning with ourselves, the ability for getting other people to introspect, the language issue, the definitions around things, etc. So I think there's a range of things there. And Ainslee, I've just noticed that you have your hand up as well. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention in regards to the return on investment, because that's been a huge thing with my business. My business is basically about trying to get businesses to be more inclusive and accessible, and which also means being inclusive. And so there's a lot of discussions about, okay, so for me to do, like for a business to do that, how much is it going to cost? So it always comes down to that return on investment, rather than thinking about the human aspect of it. So as opposed to what it would mean to include a diverse group of people who are on the margins.
No, it's such a fascinating subject, and I think we've only scratched the surface here at this stage in terms of what could be done. We got about 15 minutes to go, and I thought what I'd do is, unless anyone else has anything they want to add on or build on from what we've just been discussing, please do so. Just unmute yourself and start talking. But next time, our plan was to come back and try to summarize, I guess, what we've talked about today and what we begin to learn and seeing some of the challenges, and come back next time and talk a little bit about what we might do to embrace diversity inclusion from two angles, both as learning and development professionals delivering and working with people of various types, but also in our ability to influence their organizations and the community around us. So I'm looking at that aspect. And But I thought maybe we might end, and then I'd love everybody to be involved in this. So, you know, not just the panelists, but everybody and anybody to have a think about what are some things that can be done to help create a better understanding that you may have seen or that you think could be valuable. And I want to throw something out to you to get your feedback on, just to see what it was like. A bunch of years ago, there was a restaurant down on St. Kilda Road called Pitch Black. And it was based on an experiment that was done in America somewhere, Florida, I think. And basically it was a restaurant where it was pitch black. So you would went in and it was to replicate the sense of going into a restaurant as a blind person. So that was where the experiment came from, and to experiment. And so they set one up there in a hotel in St. Kilda, and it was exactly that. The waiters and had the night lenses on, but you went in, and from the moment you walked in, you had no idea how big the room was, what the tables looked like, how many other people were in the room. And for the whole hour and a half that you were there, you couldn't see, you know, there was no light at all. You couldn't see your fingers in front of your face in any way, shape, or form. And I took my two daughters there because I thought this is an interesting experience. And I wasn't really thinking about diversity, but I thought this is something that I would never experience. And it was like Adam saying before, he hasn't experienced, you know, being a user of a wheelchair. And I'm thinking back on that now. Is that something that helps raise awareness, or is that just a gimmick or whatever? And I suspect there's a little bit of both, but I know for us, it was me and my two daughters, it was certainly a very interesting process, particularly as we were in the room and one of the other tables was a hen's night and another one of the tables was a buck's night. So you can imagine what was going on in this room. But what was also interesting is that we stayed to the end because I wanted to talk to the manager. So when they turned on the lights, you were in this horrible little room with these tables that you wouldn't put in a clubhouse, and no one knew because the food was delicious and everything else. But I just wanted to throw it out. First of all, any feedback on that about is that something we can be doing to experience things? And then what else have you seen in this last 10 minutes or so? What other things have we seen that we might do to help raise awareness, either in ourselves or with other people?
I'm fascinated by that, and I think it is more than a gimmick, because I think the whole thing about inclusion starts with education. And I think Lyndal said before, we don't know what we don't know. And I remember watching, a friend of mine runs a program in Victoria, or used to, it's a while since I've seen it, but it was called Hearing Voices. And it was about people who are the carers of or family of people with this psychiatric condition of they hear voices in the head. Mm-hmm. And it's schizophrenia, but a particular branch of schizophrenia. And you go into this course and you put the headphones on, and while you're listening to the facilitator up the front, every now and then during the headphones, every now and then through the headphones, a voice says, "Why did she look at you like that? She doesn't like you." And you sit there learning about the schizophrenia while experiencing it at the same time. And I was fascinated by it. She wouldn't let me go to the course though. But Andrew Denton did, and he did it on the ABC, where he sat through the course. And they started the day with a sort of a intelligence testing to test your dexterity and intelligence. And by morning tea, Andrew Denton, who's a very bright fella, couldn't complete the intelligence test because he'd had these voices in his head for half a day, and it changed the way he viewed people. I'm not suggesting that we do this in primary school for all our kids, but I think education is the key, because those unconscious biases, the reason we can't change them is because we've had them since we were an embryo. They've been fed into us a little bit like Sonali's experience in the village, in the town where she lived. She was constantly bombarded by these images of transgender people begging on the streets. So when it comes to living in Australia and meeting with a transgender business owner you must be about 25 years old. So 25 years of that training goes into your head. And it takes a long time to overcome 25 years of indoctrination. And so please, I'm going to say, please let yourself off the hook. All of us, by the way, because, and I've been holding on to this one, guilt and shame are the most useless emotions we can feel. They don't move us forward. They keep us where we are, and they stop us from learning things. So this is my own bias, guilt and shame. And this is going to what Amy was saying before. If we make people feel shame because of their unconscious biases, that's a terrible unconscious bias you have, they're not going to reveal them anymore. We need to understand that and you've said we've all got them. I don't know mine, that's why they're called unconscious. But we've all got them, and we need to be bringing them to the surface, allowed to bring them to the surface, safe to bring them to the surface so that we can deal with them.
Adam, thank you very much, sorry, Bill, for that thoughtful comment, but I do a fairly decent job now of recognizing that I need to manage guilt and shame. And no good change comes out of there.
No, absolutely. It sends us backwards. So anyway, that were my two bobs worth. So
thanks. Anyone else got some ideas? Gail?
I'm not sure if this is on the right track, but I've just written down here that one of the things that we can best do to include people is not to decide what they can and can't do. Several of the people that I interviewed for the book said, we don't get invited to things because people say, oh, well, you wouldn't be able to get into my house in your wheelchair. So straight away, there's the exclusion. Everybody else is excited about going to a party or a function or whatever, and they know they're not included. Nobody has bothered to ask these people, would you like to come? And is there a way that we could help for you to get into our place? Or do you have your own ramp? Or, but they would like to be able to make their own decisions rather than other people making an assumption about them. And just an experience I had, my dad developed motor neurone disease, and I was in a large shopping centre one day, and there was a guy in an electric wheelchair with severe disabilities. I went up to him and I said, look, would you mind me asking you a few questions about your wheelchair, because Dad's got MND and we need to get him an electric wheelchair and we don't know what we're doing. It turns out this guy had very severe cerebral palsy. His speech was very slow and slurred, but we actually had a conversation for a half an hour. He gave me so much information that would be useful for Dad. And at the end, I thanked him for his time and for helping me. And he absolutely beamed at me. And I know that beaming smile was because I'd had a conversation and I hadn't even shown any inkling that he had a disability. And I'm sure that that's how everybody would like to be treated. I saw an interview with a guy with Down syndrome speaking to an international congress, and he said, I need to be loved, valued, and sometimes helped. So if we can just ask people, do you need assistance, or let me know if there's any way I can help you, rather than making any assumptions.
That's nice. That's nice. Does anybody have any questions for each other, or anything that they want to offer? I mean, there's been so many things here and I've been sort of directing questions. Fran, yes, please.
Yeah, I just thought of one of the things that I've used in my practice and certainly heard from somebody else, and I think it's kind of a good moving on point, is the difference between intent and impact. And I think, sometimes, whereas I don't believe that we should be coming from a place of shame or guilt. On the other hand, I don't think we can use it as an excuse for not doing something. So I think that, that idea of saying, oh, I didn't mean that, and Adam, forgive me, like sitting on the seat, or sitting on the table, when we find ourselves sitting on the table or showing the soles of our feet to somewhere where, actually not being scared to say, look, no, I didn't mean that. But you know what? It's not about you. it's about them and the way it was received, it is in offence. It's not okay. So I think at that point, actually, for all of us to be big enough to just say, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, I definitely, you know, will do better next time, you know, like not even making the excuse that it wasn't my intention, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, does it? You know, like it's the way that the other person's taken it. And we can't know everything, but I've just found that a really useful thing to keep in my mind, because it's so tempting to just say, oh no, you've misunderstood, you know, like it's their fault. And I think, yeah, anyway, for what it's worth, my thoughts.
And I think, you know, that idea that says best intentions, but people interpret things their own way. Anybody that's married knows that, right?
Bill slipped in a marriage joke there.
Wasn't much of a joke by the sounds of it. But listen, guys, I'm reminded of somebody that I read about years ago, and he was a person who was in the growth phase, particularly in the consulting phase, and one of these people that had a passion, like I think all of us here, with lifelong learning, and that you learn something every day, and it wasn't trying to learn 100%, it was learning 1% each day. And I think that part of the process of embracing diversity, inclusion, and so much else is that small steps. Each day, if we do something, then it's going to make a difference. And one of the things that this fellow had, he said, I'm always staggered about how dumb I was 2 weeks ago. And, you know, that's how I feel even every day almost. It's just, I can't feel how dumb I was 2 weeks ago. And today I feel a lot smarter. And I know that that 2 weeks from now, I'm still going to feel like I was dumb today. And that's part of that process. So I wanted to just, again, if anybody has anything to say, I just wanted to say this has been a fantastic session. I wish we had 1,000 people on it to learn, and I don't know why we didn't, but I will find out as best I can. But I really don't care. I just had a great conversation, and I hope you did as well. And I hope you'll be back in 2 weeks, and we can draw some others in. And please, if you have others that you'd like to invite along, just let me know, and we'll make sure that happens. And if you could share with me on things like LinkedIn, some of your feelings about what we did today, so that we can maybe draw in more of our colleagues to this process. So I just wanted to say a huge thanks to everybody that's here today, particularly the people that I have worked with. So Amy and Gail and Ainslee, Lyndal, Adam, and Andrew and Sonali, but also everyone else, and for everybody just contributing in any different way. Just by being here, I think we've all grown. So thank you, everyone, and please stay tuned with what ILP is doing. We've got the next diversity one, and then after that in March, we're shifting into more of a building your business kind of process. So looking at online training, and then writing for success and writing for results, and a range of other things. And I think it's going to be another great year of learning for all of us. And Carrie, as I said earlier, wasn't able to attend today for personal reasons, but I know she's going to love listening to this conversation. And just a last reminder that we have our weekly member lounge, 10 o'clock every Friday morning, Melbourne time. It's free to come along. If anybody wants to join us, just let me know and I'll send you the link so that you can come in. It's the same link every week. So if you want to put it in your calendars, and if you can join us, you can join us. If you can't, that's okay. But thank you, everyone. All the very best.
Thank you, Bill.
All the very best.
Bye.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you,
Thank
Bill.
you.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.